All right, today we're going to trace the epic story of how a few really radical ideas managed to topple entire empires and really give birth to the world we live in now. So let's get right into how it all started. It all really boils down to one single fundamental question. It sounds simple, right? But for centuries, for centuries, the answer was just set in stone. Challenging it, that was completely unthinkable. And that answer? It was the divine right of kings. The idea was simple. A monarch's power, their authority, it came straight from God, not from the people they ruled. So if a king decided to raise your taxes or throw his critics in jail, well, that was just God's will. And for a very, very long time, that was just how things were. It was the undisputed political reality. But then, everything started to change. A new way of thinking began to bubble up, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, reason, not just religion and tradition, should be what guides society. And that one little idea, it turned out to be the spark that would ignite a total firestorm of revolution all across the globe. So you gotta ask, where did this crazy revolutionary idea even come from? It didn't just pop up overnight. Nope. It was the result of this huge intellectual shift that completely rewired how people thought about, well, everything. Power, rights, and even the very idea of government itself. This whole movement was called the Enlightenment. All of a sudden, thinkers started asking questions like, wait a minute, what's actually fair? And what really makes sense here? Instead of just blindly accepting tradition. They truly believed that if we just used our reason, humanity could solve its biggest problems and, build a much better society for everyone. Okay, so one of the most powerful concepts to come out of all this was something called the social contract, and you can see how the idea evolved. First, you had a guy named Thomas Hobbes, who basically said people need a strong, absolute ruler to keep everything from falling into total chaos. But then, John Locke comes along and completely flips the script. He argued that a government's only job is to protect our natural rights. And after him, Rousseau took it even one step further, saying a government has to follow the general will, basically the collective good of all the people. And this right here, this is the real bombshell. Locke straight up argued that if a government breaks that contract, if it fails to protect your rights, then the people have the right to rebel, to overthrow it. This wasn't just some abstract philosophy anymore, it was a green light for revolution. So where's the first place these ideas really get put to the test? Well, it was in England. And what's interesting is it wasn't some huge bloody war. It was more like a really smart political chess move that ended up changing the balance of power for good.
See, King James II was acting like a classic absolute monarch, totally ignoring Parliament, arresting anyone who criticized him. So Parliament did something pretty radical. They reached out and invited a foreign prince, William of Orange, to come to England with an army and take the throne. And the moment James II realized he'd lost all his support, he just fled. Just like that, power had shifted, and believe it or not, barely a single shot was fired.
And what came out of all this was the English Bill of Rights. This was a huge deal. It was a legal document that basically said, hey, Mr. King, you are not above the law. It meant the monarch couldn't just raise taxes or build an army whenever they felt like it. They needed Parliament's permission. This was the birth of the constitutional monarchy, the idea that power has to be shared. Okay, so that's England. Now let's jump across the Atlantic and see how this idea started to evolve. Because over in America, English colonists were starting to feel like their rights were being trampled on. And they were about to use those very same Enlightenment ideas to justify not just limiting the king's power, but breaking away from him completely. So here's the setup. Britain was deep in debt from fighting all these wars, and they looked at their American colonies and thought, aha, let's tax them to pay for it. Well, this led to some pretty iconic acts of defiance, right? We've all heard of the Boston Tea Party, where colonists literally dumped shiploads of British tea into the harbor because they refused to pay a tax they had absolutely no say in. And when you boil it all down, the core issue was pretty simple: taxation without representation. From where the colonists were sitting, the British government was totally breaking that social contract we just talked about. They were taking their property, right, in the form of taxes, without getting any consent from the people they were governing. A major no-no. And here it is. Look at this. It's as plain as day. The Declaration of Independence is basically pure John Locke. That whole idea that all people are born with natural rights and that government only exists to protect those rights. That right there is the engine of the American Revolution. laid out in black and white for the entire world to see. But if the American Revolution was like a focused, deliberate breakup, the French Revolution was a whole different beast. It was more like a chaotic, society-shattering earthquake. I mean, it was way more violent, and its goals were so much more radical. Just look at this contrast. It's insane. French society was rigidly, and I mean rigidly, divided. You had the first and second estates, that's the clergy and the nobility, living these lives of incredible luxury, and they paid almost zero taxes. And then you had the third estate, which was, basically everyone else. And they were stuck shouldering the entire financial burden of the nation. It was a system that was just begging to explode. And that explosion, it finally came on July 14th, 1789. An angry mob stormed the Bastille, which was this medieval prison that had become a symbol of the king's oppressive power. This was it. This was the point of no return. The revolution wasn't about debates and pamphlets anymore. It was about violent, direct action. But all that promise of liberty, it descended really quickly into paranoia and just absolute bloodshed. This period became known as the Reign of Terror. You had extremists, led by a guy named Maximilien Robespierre, executing tens of thousands of people, including the king and queen, often for the silliest, flimsiest reasons. The revolution, in a very real way, started to eat its own children. And then, out of all this chaos, this one figure emerges, Napoleon Bonaparte. And he is a total paradox. On the one hand, he completely ends France's democratic experiment, right? He seizes power and literally crowns himself emperor. But on the other hand, he kind of saved its core ideas. He created the Napoleonic Code, which guaranteed legal equality and protected property rights. And then his armies marched all across Europe, spreading these very same Enlightenment principles, weirdly enough, through conquest. You see, the ideas that were unleashed by the American and French revolutions, well, they couldn't be put back in the box. They spread like wildfire, crossing oceans and inspiring people absolutely everywhere to fight for their own freedom and self-rule. And maybe the most radical revolution of them all happened in the French colony of Haiti. Think about this. Inspired by all the talk of liberty coming out of France, the enslaved people on the island rose up. Led by the incredible Toussaint Louverture, they fought and defeated the armies of France, Spain, and Britain to create the very first independent Black republic in history. Absolutely amazing. And that fire just kept spreading, this time all across Latin America, where a whole new generation of revolutionary leaders rose up. In the north, you have the famous Simón Bolívar, the liberator, who thought to free a whole bunch of nations. Down south, José de San Martín led his army on this unbelievable march across the Andes Mountains. And over in Mexico, it was actually a priest, Miguel Hidalgo, whose call for independence kicked off a decade-long struggle. You had an entire continent remaking itself based on these new ideals. And so there you have it. This incredible chain reaction of revolutions, all sparked by one powerful idea, that power belongs to the people, is what created the world we live in today. But it really leaves us with a final lingering thought, doesn't it? The questions they were asking back then: who has the right to rule? How should we organize our society? Those questions are still being debated and even fought over right now. It just goes to show you, the legacy of these revolutions is still very, very much alive.